afternoon. My name is Socrates Xanthus. I'm the finance professor for commercial real estate at the University of Central Florida. And today we're going to do an exercise that's quite complicated or complex, but I think this video will help you get through it pretty easily. You can feel free to stop and pause it as much as you want as you kind of get through the exercise. This video is covering an exercise that I will share. It is a building a commercial complex that has 4 tenants, and there's a bank that has an out parcel, a retailer, an office, 2 offices with different square footage. Each tenant's lease has some base rate in terms of the square footage. The out parcel has a base rate of $85,000, and you can see the current lease rate for each of the tenants. The rent growth rate for the tenants are here, and 2 of them are actually growing at CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. And you have 2 of the tenants that have an expense cap, which means that they will you can recover up to these caps for each of these tenants. 2 tenants, the retailer and the office 2. And you have the expense, OPEX expense that's been given to you. These are all inputs for utilities, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. The costs are here, and the growth rate for each of these OPEX expenses are here. The consumer price index rate of increases are here for years 1 through 3, 4 through 7, and years 8 through 10. And you have additional inputs that you need: the going-in cap rate, the terminal cap rate, loan interest rate, and all of the information you need for your loan information. Of course, this exercise, I'm going to be using different numbers so that you can actually go back through the assignment and make sure that you have the right information in this template here. I would advise that you pause the video before starting to do this exercise along with the video and complete the tables you see here. The rent roll table, as you can see, these are all inputs. The information that you see that are in gray are all inputs that are given to you. You'll find that in the assignment sheet. And so the expenses are also information that's been given to you, as we showed earlier. The consumer price index increase rates are also given to you for years 1 through 10, but we're only holding the property for 5 years. So for years 8 and 10, this may not be necessary. Nonetheless, it's given to you. You are given the discount rate and the purchase cap rate as well, but not the price information. So you have to calculate that using the cap rate formula. You're also given the disposition information, the exit cap rate, the cost of the sale, as well as the hold period. You can create the loan table here, given the interest rate, amortization, term, the loan to value, the debt service coverage ratio of 1.42. This is going to be a tricky and interesting one because in this exercise, we're asked to, the bank will give you the maximum loan or the minimum of these 2 loans. So whichever one is the lowest will be the one you're going to be using as the debt. So that's going to be the maximum debt you'll get, but you'll use the minimum equal min form function to pick one of these 2 potential loans to calculate your annual payments. And then, of course, you're going to calculate the investment information with the purchase price, loan cost, the debt, and of course, the initial investment, which is a key calculation that you should be able to do. You should also create your annual cash flow table here. Before we start going through the exercise, you want to pause the video, create your annual cash flow table all the way down to unlevered before tax cash flow. And of course, you're going to also do the sales proceed before tax. And these are all of the questions or answers we're looking for, questions you're asked, that answers you need to provide upon completing the exercise. What I've also done for you is I've put a little note next to each of these tables indicating which one you should do first, second, third, fourth, and so on. For example, you would start with the rent roll first to calculate the base rent, and you would move down to the retail sales for years 1 through 6. then you would move on to the annual cash flow table. And the reason you're doing that is because you cannot calculate the sales price because you don't have one until you get your NOI. You can only calculate that once you get your year one NOI. So we're going to complete this table before you do the find out what the purchase price is. Upon completing that, you will switch over to the loan information to calculate the LTV, the debt service coverage ratio, which also uses the NOI. And then you'll be able to move on to calculate which debt you're going to use, as well as your initial investment. Then you're going to move down to the lender points, calculate the annual payment. So that's the order of how we're going to complete this exercise. And we're going to go ahead and start with step one. Step one, given the rent roll, you're going to calculate or establish the base rent. The base rent for out parcels given to you. So you're simply going to hit equal the amount for the out parcel, which is $84,475. And for the base rent for the retailer, office one and office two, it's simply going to be the square footage times the price per square feet. And if you did that correctly, you don't need to anchor anything. You can just drag it down. It will give you as you can see, the base rent for office one and office two as well. Pretty simple. To calculate the natural break for the retailer, this is the only tenant that has a percent rent, which we calculated showed you how to calculate the percent rent. The natural break is simply going to be using the base rent divided by the percent rent for that tenant, which gives you $727,000. That is the natural break. So what that means is that anytime the tenant's sales exceeds this natural break, they're going to pay an additional 5.5% of the difference between the sales amount and the natural break. And so if you did that, and I apologize, you should also calculate the total area. The total area, not including the art parcel, is the sum of retailer one, retailer office one, and office two, which should give you $18,975. You're going to need that information to calculate several of the questions asked of you in this exercise. Moving on to step two, we're going to calculate the retailer's sales. Since this is the only one here that is on a percent rent lease, you're going to calculate the actual sales, potential sales for years 2 through 6. It says here that the retailer's sales are increasing at 2.5% a year. We do know that year one is 800,000. It's given, that information is given to you. We're going to simply use the growth rate formula here to calculate the sales amount for years 2 through 6 using the growth rate formula, which is the previous year's time one plus the actual growth rate. We're going to anchor that because the growth rate is not changing year over year. Once you do that, you can simply drag the formula across to get the potential sales amount for year 6. You can see it's using the previous year's times 1 plus the actual growth rate. So that is step number 2. Step number 3, we're going to go ahead and begin our cash flow table. And the bank, for year 1, we were told that we found out that the base rent is 84,000, so you can simply move the 84,000 down to year 1. But we also were told that the bank's the rent is increasing at 2.15% annually. And to do that, we're going to simply use the growth rate formula again. It's the previous year times open paren 1 plus the actual growth rate, which is 2.15%. We're going to go ahead and anchor the growth rate since that's not changing year over year. And by doing so, we can drag it across to year 6. Retailer, we were told that the retailer is actually, the sales for year 1 is $800,000, but it does exceed the natural break. So we're going to go ahead and use that as our basis for calculating the actual rent amount for years 1 through through 6. What we're going to do is we remember the formula for calculating the sales, the rent using the percent rent. We're going to say that if this number, which is the actual first year sales, if it's greater than the actual natural break, we're going to multiply it. If it exceeds that, we're going to simply, we're going to go ahead and do a open paren. We're going to subtract this number by the natural break, and we're going to use that number. We're going to multiply that by the actual percent increase. And if not, it's gonna not gonna give us anything extra. But we are also gonna always add the actual base rent to the rent for the year. So we did the percent, but we're gonna also add the base rent. If you did that, you should have $44,000. What we also need to do here is we're gonna do some anchoring. We're gonna anchor everything except for the actual sales amount annually, because that's going to change every year. We're going to anchor this this cell. We're going to anchor this cell. I'm sorry, we're not going to anchor. We're not going to anchor this. We're going to anchor this cell. We're going to anchor this cell, and we're going to also anchor the base rent. By doing so, we can drag it across, and it's going to do the same calculation for years 2 through 6. And you should have $49,000 per for rent for the retailer for year 6. For Office 1 and Office 2, we were told that these two offices are increasing at CPI. You can see it here. Their rent is increasing at CPI. In order to calculate what those rates are, first of all, we know that for Office 1 and Office 2, they do have a base rent of $201 and $98,000 respectively. We're simply going to go ahead and increase it for using the CPI rate to increase their annual rent for years 2 through 6. Office 1 and Office 2, the growth rate for rent growth rate is growing at CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. They're growing at 1.75% for years 1 through 3, 2.25% for years 4 through 7, and 3.25% for years 8 through 10, although we don't need to worry about 8 through 10 since the property is being held for 5 years. So let's go ahead and do the growth rate for Office 1 and Office 2. Again, they're growing at CPI, as you can see here. To do that, we're going to do similar to the basic growth rate. We're going to say that it's equal to the previous year times, open parentheses, 1 plus if, this is the logic test, if year 2 is greater than or equal to 4, because we're saying 4 years is going to increase at a different rate. If it's greater than or equal to 4, then we're going to the value, or we're going to increase it at 2.25%. If not, it's going to increase at 1.75%. We're going to close the parentheses. That's simple. Now, what we need to do is go back and make sure we anchor the growth rate, which is F4 and F3, because those are not going to change, right, for each year. And so it's that way it's going to pick the right growth rate depending on the year that you lend on. For example, for years 2 and 3, it's going to naturally select 1.75. For years 4, 5, and 6, it's going to naturally select 2.25. That's how you do this. A little bit complicated growth rate, but if you did it correctly, you could drag it across to get the year 6 PGI for Office 1 is $223,000. We're going to do the same thing for Office 2. It's also growing at CPI, as you can see here, for the same CPI growth rate. So we're going to say equal to the previous year times, open paren, 1 plus if this year, number 2, is greater than or equal to 4, then increase that by this amount. If not, comma means if not, then increase it by this amount. And you close the parentheses. We're going to close it twice because there's 2 parentheses in here. We're going to always go back and anchor the growth rate for F1 and F3, and we should be able to drag it across to get to the PGI for Office 2 for year 6. To calculate the EGI, it's simply going to be the sum of all the PGI for all of the tenants. And if you did that correctly, you should be able to drag it across to get to $475,000 for year 6. My battery is dying, so I have to plug my battery before I lose power. Okay. All right, so once we did that, we should be able to move on to the next part of the cash flow. We're going to ignore this row for now because we can't calculate the expense per square feet until we know what the total OPEX expenses are. For utilities, we were told that utilities is per square feet is $3.25 per square feet. We also know that the building is $18,975. Not including the out parcel. So for utilities, you're simply going to do it, since it's an expense, you're going to make sure it's negative, equal negative the total area for the building, for the complex, times the expense per square feet, which is $325. So you have negative $61,000, and the utilities is growing at $2.85%. And we're going to use a simple growth rate formula, the previous year times open paren 1 plus the growth rate of 285. And we're going to anchor that since it's going to be the same for subsequent years. And we're going to drag it across to get to year 6 at $70,000, negative $70,000 for year 6 for utilities. For taxes, it's treated a little differently. Taxes is a flat amount. We're just going to make that a negative number. The taxes up here, it's $11,000. We're going to bring that down as a negative number, but it is growing at 2.75%. We're going to use the same growth rate formula the previous year times open paren 1 plus the growth rate, and we're going to anchor the growth rate and close the parentheses, and we're going to drag it across to get to year 6 taxes at $13,000. For insurance, we're going to do the same thing we did for utilities. It's going to be equal negative the total area times the insurance price per insurance per square feet, which is $2.75, and you should have negative $52,000. It is growing at 2.5%. We're going to use the same growth rate formula, and we're going to say previous years times open paren 1 plus the growth rate of 2.5%. Anchor the growth rate, and we're going to drag it across to get to year 6 at negative $59,000. Now for maintenance, same thing we did above. It is going to be equal to a negative the square footage for the complex times the $3 per square feet for maintenance. We're going to anchor. We don't need to anchor that. I'm sorry. And but for year 2 rather, we're going to use the same growth rate formula. The maintenance, which is the year 1 maintenance times open paren 1 plus the growth rate of 3.25%. Anchor that and close the parentheses. You should be able to drag it across to year 6 to get to negative $66,000. If you did that correctly, you should be able to calculate the total OPEX, which is the sum of all of the OPEX you have here. And that should give you $182,000. If you drag it across, there's no anchoring required. For year 6 should be $210,000. Once you get that, you should now be able to calculate the OPEX per square feet. If you know the total area for the building, you simply need to, since you need to bring this as a positive number and the total OPEX is negative, you're going to start with equal negative. Negative will change the sign to a positive number. So the total OPEX divided by the total square footage for that complex, it's going to give you $9.61 per expense per square feet. And if you did that correctly, you're going to anchor, by the way, anchor the total area, which is the J7 for me. If you did that correctly, you can drag it across to get to what is the expense per square feet for in year six, the projected expense per square feet for year six, which would be $11.07. Okay. Okay. If we did that, just make sure to put aside. Perfect. If we did that, we should be able to now go back down here to calculate the expense recovery. The expense recovery is not difficult, but it's important that you know how to calculate it. To do that, we're simply going to say equal if this number here, this $9.61 per square feet, if it's greater than the expense cap for that retailer, that's the one that has an expense cap of $5.75. If it's greater than that, simply multiply that $5.75 times the square footage for that retailer, comma, if not, multiply the square footage for that retailer times the $9.61 and close the parentheses. If you did that, you should be able to get the $28,000 for the retailer as expense recovery. So you'll be able to recover this amount from the retailer. We're going to go back and anchor everything except for the dollar per square feet for expenses, so we're going to anchor everything here. The expense cap is going to be anchored. So is the square footage, and the square footage will be anchored as well. But we're not going to anchor the $9.61 because we want that number the formula rather, to flow over year for years 2 through 6. If we did that correctly, we can drag it across to get the expense recovery for years 2 through 6. Now, it is interesting that the numbers are the same. The reason the numbers are the same for years 1 through 6 is because the expense cap, as you can see here, is $5.75 for the retailer. It just so happens that their expense cap is less than the expense per square feet, the OPEX expense per square feet that this building is experiencing. So the most that the landlord can recover from this tenant is that $5.75 times the square footage, which equates to $28,750. Now we're going to do it for Office 2 as well. Office 2, though, has an expense cap of $10 per square feet. So we're going to do the same formula for Office 2, equal if the OPEX expense per square feet, if it's greater than this expense cap of $10, then you will multiply the $10 times the expense, the square footage for Office 2. If not, it's going to be the square footage for Office 2 times the OPEX expense per square feet. And we're going to go ahead and close the parentheses. The only thing we're going to do differently, go back and do rather, is we're going to go ahead and anchor everything except for the dollar per square feet for OPEX. So we're going to anchor the expense cap. We're going to anchor the expense cap. We're going to anchor the square footage for that tenant, anchor the square footage. And if we did that correctly, we should be able to drag it across. And you'll notice that it's not going to be the same amount for year over year because in some years, the expense cap is greater than the expense per square feet. In some years, it's less than the expense per square feet. So that's why unlike retailer, where the expense cap was always less than the OPEX expense per square feet, for Office 2, the expense cap is not always less than the OPEX expense per square feet. Once you calculate that, you can calculate now the total OPEX expense recovery. It's simply equal sum of these two rows. That's the total recovery amount that you're going to recover from these two tenants. You drag it across. No need to anchor anything here. We're just simply copying the formula equal sum across each year. Now to calculate the NOI is calculated using similar sum function, equals sum of the EGI, comma, the total OPEX, comma, and how much you're recovering, which is the $70,000 for year one. If you close the parentheses, you should have $316,000 for year one. If you drag it across, you should end the year 6 with a total NOI of $338,000. With that information, now you can calculate the purchase price. We're going to use a simple CapEx formula. We have the NOI, we have the cap rate. We just need the not the CapEx. We're going to cap rate formula. I'm sorry. We have the total NOI. We have the cap rate. We're going to be able to calculate the price using the cap rate formula, which is simply the NOI divided by the entry purchase cap rate, which should give us $5.1 million. That's the purchase price for the property. With that information, we can now move over to the loan box and calculate the loan information, because as you know, you can't calculate a loan without knowing the purchase price, correct? So we needed to do all this work here to get the price in order to calculate the LTV and, of course, the debt service coverage ratio. So now we're going to be able to select one of these two loans, whichever one is less. And let's start with the LTV. LTV of 5.1 million. First and foremost, we're going to move the price information up here. It's equal to 5.1 million. Move it up here. And we're going to calculate what is 65% of 5.1 million. 65% times 5.1 million is simply going to be 3.3 million. Now, this is one that's going to be a little tricky for folks to calculate the potential loan using the debt service coverage ratio. To do so, we're going to use this formula: equal negative PV, open paren. Excel's giving us a little bit of hints here. Rate, of course, rate is going to be divided by 12 since it's calculated monthly. The number of periods is going to be 20 times 12 to get a monthly period. It's asking us for the payment. This is the part that you have to calculate using the NOI. It's going to be the NOI divided by the debt service coverage ratio divided by 12. Doing this in close up parentheses will give you the potential loan information using the debt service coverage ratio. What this means is that if the bank gives you a debt service coverage ratio of 1.42, they can tell you what the loan would be given your NOI and the loan terms as your actual debt. Now, what you're going to need to do here once you calculate the actual potential debt, I'm calling it potential debt, is because in this exercise, it's asking you to get the lower of the two potential loans. To do that, you go to debt up here. You're going to use the men function in Excel, equal men, and equal men, not mem, equal men. And Excel's asking you what's the range of the numbers you want to get the minimum amount for. There's only two cells here. We're going to highlight both of these potential loans. Let Excel tell you which one is the lower of the two. Of course, you can eyeball it and see that it's 3.2 million, but it's important that you let Excel do it for you so that if your LTV changes, it will always select the lower of the two potential loan. With that information, now you can calculate the lender point. The lender point is going to be used. It's going to be 2% of the debt. So it's going to be equal to 2% times the actual debt. I wouldn't use this one. I would use whatever is up here because that's your actual debt. So it's going to be $64,000. You can go ahead and bring up the loan cost up here now. So that's going to be the $64,000. With that information, you can calculate the initial investment amount. The initial investment amount is always going to be the purchase price plus the loan cost minus the debt. That's going to be your initial investment. So in order to buy this property using the debt service coverage ratio of 1.42, you need to have $2.2 million to purchase this $5.1 million property. Now, the next thing is to calculate the annual payment. We're going to use the Excel payment function, which Excel gives you these hints on how to calculate payment. By now, you should be able to do it. If you're doing these complex leases, you should be able to calculate payment using the payment function, which is equal payment, open paren, rate divided by 12, and then, of course, the number of periods times 12. And then, of course, the, times 12. And then the present value, which is the loan amount or the debt amount, and then the future value is going to be zero, because after 20 years, if you amortize it over 20 years, you would not have any amount left. So your annual or monthly payment is $18,000, but you need an annual, so you're just going to multiply that number by 12 at the end to get the annual. You could have done that in two different cells, but I prefer to do it in one cell. So basically use the payment function, and then of course after you close the parentheses, you multiply it by 12 to get the annual payment, or also referred to as your debt services. Now that you have your debt services, you can actually come down and bring down your debt service up here equal to the debt service amount, and you're going to anchor that. The reason you're going to anchor that is because the debt is not going to change over time, and it's going to be the same amount year over year. So you can drag it across to year 5, not year 6, because if you're holding the property for year 5, you don't know what the buyer's debt service is going to be. And if you decide to refinance it after 5 years, you will probably get a different loan amount as well, or different debt service as well. So you never take your debt service beyond your hold period of 5 years. Okay, perfect. Now that you're done with that, you can calculate your before tax cash flow, which is the sum of your NOI and your debt service, and that's going to give you $93,000 for year 1. No need to anchor. You can drag it across to year 5 to get $110,000 for year 5. For the levered before tax cash flow, it is going to be the same as the above row, with the exception of year 5. So you're just going to say equal to whatever is above for the before tax cash flow. You're going to drag it all the way across to year 5. The only thing you're going to do here, I'm going to remind you to highlight year 5, because we're going to treat year 5 differently, because you're holding the property for 5 years. You're going to need to add something to the before tax cash flow. It's going to be the net value. So we're going to have to calculate the net value using the sales proceeds before tax table before we know exactly what the levered before tax cash flow amount is for year 5. Again, for unlevered before tax cash flow, we're going to do the same thing. If you do not have a loan, that's what unlevered means. The unlevered before tax cash flow is going to be the NOI. So you're going to bring down the NOI. We're going to drag it across to year 5. Again, we're going to highlight year 5 just as a reminder that we need to go ahead and do this sales proceeds before tax table before we can calculate year 5 and for both levered and unlevered before tax cash flow. And to calculate the gross value or sales price for at the end of year 5, we're going to use year 6 NOI, use the same exact cap rate formula. It's going to be the year 6 NOI divided by the exit cap rate, which is 5.6%. So you can sell this property for $6 million. And if you have the selling cost of 4%, in order to calculate the selling cost, you're going to say equal to negative 4% times the $6 million, which will give you negative $241,000. So it's going to cost you $241,000 to sell this property at the rate of 4% of your as a selling cost. This is probably the harder next step is the hardest part for a lot of students, is calculating the debt retirement. But by now you should be able to do it pretty easily. The debt retirement is using this function is going to be equal to negative the debt amount, which is the 3.2 million, minus this cumulative parent function. And when you do that, Excel is going to give you some hints. The hints are, what are the rates? So let's go find the rate divided by 12. It's going to tell you again, it's going to be the number of period, which is 20, times 12. It's going to ask you for the present value, which is again the debt, comma. It's going to ask you what's the start period. You can use any one. It's 1. And the end period is going to be, year, the whole period times 12. And then you're going to close it out with a 0 at the end to get the debt retirement. Your debt retirement for after 5 years should be $2.6 million. To calculate the net value, you're going to simply sum the price and all of the expenses, including the debt retirement, to get what are you going to walk away with? You're going to walk away with $3.1 million. With that information, you can now go over to step number 9 to calculate the levered before tax cash flow by adding the net value to the before tax cash flow for year 5. You should have $3.3 million for year 5. We're going to do the similar um, exercise, if you will, for unlevered before tax cash flow. The only difference is that we don't have a loan for unlevered. That's what unlevered means. So you're going to add the gross value, and you're going to also add the selling cost, but not the debt retirement. If you do that, you should have $6.1 million for the unlevered before tax cash flow for year 5. With that information, you should now be able to answer all of these questions, which is the max debt for the property. That happens to be, when we use the min function, it's up here. We also have calculated the equity needed for this property, which is the initial investment right here, and also ask for the net value. This is the levered net value, which is this. And then it asks for the total expense recovery, which is row 36 up here. It also asks for the NOI, which is the row 37. And last but not least, the gross sales price, which we calculated up here, and it's up here. So I hope this was a good video for you to help you calculate this very complicated lease with multiple different types of leases, including a percent lease, if you will, for the retailer. And hopefully this helped you with this exercise. Until next time, take care.